Minister, the amount of rainfall we've been experiencing over the last number of months has pushed the agriculture sector to a crisis point. We've seen almost 10 months of almost non-stop rainfall. Farms are saturated. A few days' break in rain isn't enough for fields to dry out. This has been an absolutely devastating time for farmers across all sectors. For livestock farmers, some are having to provide supplementary feed for much longer periods than expected as animals remained indoors. Slurry tanks are at capacity and farmers' silage and fodder stocks are depleted. Many are struggling to afford to buy additional silage and fodder needed to feed their animals. In addition, there's a reduction in beef prices. The IFA last week called out factories for attempting to take advantage of the weather difficulties beef farmers are facing by trying to pull prices. The current prices are over 10 cents per kg behind this time last year, while beef prices in the UK are running 12 cents per kg ahead of last year. So factories in the north are actually offering more for our cattle than factories here. There's absolutely no justification for that. Farmers are under an immense amount of pressure at the moment and can't be expected to spend all their time arguing with factories over insultingly low beef prices. Minister, I've consistently called for reform of the meat processing sector, including a statutory beef regulator who can deal with the industry once and for all, and your claims that a food regulator would cut it, I think, have proven hollow. The Beef Tribunal in the early 90s highlighted widespread improper relationships between the beef industry and government. It also stressed the lack of regulation and the impact it had on the sector. And today, 30 years later, we haven't seen any changes. The system is still designed to enrich the beef barons while small farms fade away and young farmers have no choice but to pursue other careers. The financial pressure on small farms is always immense. Cash flow is incredibly tight. This is also putting a huge strain on farmers in terms of stress and confidence in the viability of their farms going forward. Potato farmers are currently working around the clock to get crops planted during this brief dry spell. By mid-April, potato growers would have usually planted 21,000 acres. On Sunday, Sean Ryan, chair of the Potato Committee of the Irish Farmers Association, estimated that only around 50 had been planted so far. These sustained wet periods and droughts are here to stay. Our weather patterns are changing and we have to adapt to it. When it comes to the potato sector, the rooster crop developed by Teagasc makes up most of the market. It also has a very long growing season that just isn't compatible with the wet weather and later planting seasons that we're experiencing. Tillage has probably been the sector hit one of the worst by the long period of wet weather. The ground and the majority of fields just cannot carry any form of machinery at the moment, and farmers are now facing the hard decision on whether to risk sowing or leave land fallow. There's a limited window to sow crops and it's looking near impossible to plant certain ones. The ideal planting period for beans, winter wheat and oats has passed and the window is rapidly closing on being able to get any form of a viable crop. When harvest times are delayed, there's a huge reduction in yield and in quality. Teagasc's head of crop knowledge department, Michael Hennessy, has stated that at this stage 70 to 80% of all tillage crops would normally be planted, but this year, as far as spring crops are concerned, we have almost nothing done. Tillage is a hugely important part of our agri-food sector and the rural economy, and its future is in danger. Tillage production is currently limited to only about 7% of all agricultural land, according to a report published yesterday by the Society of Chartered Surveyors Ireland and Teagasc. Farmers are suggesting that there could be up to an 11% drop in the amount of acreage used for tillage this year, following a 7% drop already in 2023. This cannot become a trend year on year. It will be the destruction of the tillage sector. A UCD report from 2020 shows that the Irish tillage sector generates 1.3 million in economic outputs and supports 11,000 jobs, and that's nowhere near the tillage sector's full potential. Also, it has the lowest greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture, and it's already carbon neutral in many cases. We should be doing everything we can to support sectors like tillage, who are crucial to our food security and to climate action. But despite all of this, the sector is just not being supported properly, and tillage farmers are under more severe pressure than they ever have been. The announcement of €100 per hectare tillage payment to deal with immediate pressure is very, very welcome, but it just doesn't go far enough. Farming organisations are clear that in order to prevent farmers from leaving tillage entirely, a payment of €250 per hectare would be required. 2023 was devastating for tillage, with difficult weather, high fuel and fertiliser costs and a significant fall in grain prices. Teagasc has estimated that tillage farm incomes for 2023 were expected to reduce to 37,000 at a 54% drop from the previous year. The overall drop in Irish tillage farmers' incomes equates to over 260 million in 2023 compared to 2022. The state set out plans to grow tillage to a target of 400,000 hectares by 2023. But so far, your plan is failing abysmally, and it can't be blamed, all be blamed, on the weather. Tillage farmers are finding it extremely difficult to rent land, as other farmers, especially those adjusting to changes in the nitrates derogation, have capacity to pay more to lease land. And tillage farmers are being priced out. They simply cannot compete. We need to be innovative in how we ensure the tillage sector has a viable future. We need to look at measures like crop insurance for farmers, something which is common across Europe. They need interventions to enable them to compete in renting land, and the Minister needs to address the policies that are forcing dairy farmers consistently to use more and more land. The government's tillage incentive scheme did lead to an increase in the area under tillage. However, this was mainly of advantage to non-tillage farmers. This was especially demoralising as farmers who invested in tillage couldn't get the benefits of that scheme. Increased Irish production of cereals and pulses, fruit and vegetables would make Irish agriculture more environmentally friendly, would support Irish producers and would improve our food security. Minister, pivoting to tillage will be a challenge for the sector, but it needs to happen. We need to shift our entire agriculture sector to support farmers and producers while improving food security in the long term. The weather patterns we're experiencing are a direct result of climate change, and we can't shy away from that. The climate and biodiversity crisis are the single biggest threat to the future of farming. We have to help and support farmers to adapt to changing weather patterns and support them through the challenges they'll face with a changing climate. Exceptional needs payments, while welcome, do not recognise the reality and the performance of the challenges farmers are facing. Because if we do not adapt our farming practices and our farming supports, it will be absolutely devastating to future generations of farmers and to our food security as our country. We need to open up the conversation about the future of agriculture in this country, and the farming community knows that better than anyone else. There's an opportunity here for an exciting transformation of our farming model, but we have to be brave enough and honest enough to have the conversation. It was an absolute disgrace by this government to row back on the dairy reduction scheme, one of the recommendations in the final report of the Food Vision Dairy Group. We need to shift to a more sustainable model of farming, and part of that is a need to gradually reduce the number of cattle. The same department which incentivised farmers to increase their herds must incentivise farmers to reduce them. The government needs to support more sustainable farming models rather than forcing farmers into more intensive methods just to make ends meet. This results in farming communities being blamed for poor government policy and its impact on the environment. It's the overwhelming view of the scientific community that the agriculture sector will need to reduce emissions by 30% before 2030. Pushing back against that in order to keep the status quo will mean a sudden and difficult transition for family farms around the country to change their practices. To avoid that, Minister, you have to start now.